8 Act to 118, and the question is at Part 3, stand part. Dr David Clark.
Mr Chair, thank you. I have been keen to speak about this part of the bill right through the debate, and members opposite have held me back on various occasions, saying that the place for the debate on the delay of child support legislation was in Part 3 of the bill. And I see the Minister who's resumed responsibility in the Chair is indeed the Minister currently responsible for the bill, and no doubt that is an indication that he is preparing to defend this embarrassing back down as the Minister responsible for having backed out of the commitments he made to try to make the tax system fairer for those who deal with the child support system. We already know that the child support system, those of us in electorate offices know that the child support system, payments and so on, cause a great deal of anguish. The anguish, of course, originates often in very unhappy family situations where relationships have broken down, but often that pain is exacerbated by difficult arrangements or arrangements that have been agreed but not met, and so on. It is the stuff that electorate officers around the country deal with, and members in this House make their best efforts to resolve in a fair manner according to the law. Nobody will ever be entirely pleased with the child support arrangements. There will always be people who are better off or worse off as a result of changes. And it's fair to say, when we debated these changes in the select committees that have debated them in recent years in the term of this Parliament, we have thought about the issues of what is the fairest way and what is the trade-off with complexity, because there is no doubt that the new formula the government introduced is more complex, and it is complex because the government believes that that's a way to reach a fairer outcome, or that's the rhetoric they have put forward. There's also no doubt that this is a big shift in responsibility onto often the mothers, the primary caregiver, who is likely in many cases to receive less support in terms of the childcare they give and the funds they are entitled to. But regardless of all of that debate, the government then put forward a proposal to implement a new formula. They acknowledged along the way that there would be a high cost involved in retraining staff in the use of this formula. How they expect ordinary New Zealanders to understand it is not clear, but they said that it was fairer, and so they said that they were willing to spend a whole lot more money in the bureaucracy in order to train officials around the country to use the new formula, all on the basis that they would implement these changes to our child support systems. And then, just a few days short of Christmas, we had a press release out of the blue, and blue is the right word, out of the blue, from the Revenue Minister, announcing that the child support overhaul would be delayed. And the Minister, if I can quote him, said, "Inland Revenue has informed me," indicating, of course, that the Minister was unaware at this time that the legislation soon to be implemented in practice, unaware of where it was at. "Inland Revenue has informed me it needs more time to implement the new scheme to the high standard that the government expects." Well, these are wise words, these are high-sounding words, but actually let's not forget that the Minister is responsible for the implementation of this legislation. He is the one who brings a bill to the House to say we need to make changes in this Parliament to make the system, whatever he wants to make it, fairer, more reasonable, whatever the line is that he's pushing. The Parliament spends quite a lot of money, effectively, in terms of all the salaries in this building, the support staff and so on, passing law, and then, in this case, we have the Minister coming back to say, "My department has just informed me that the legislation soon to be introduced can't be introduced." It's the second time changes have been delayed. The Select Committee held back the changes previously, and now we have a situation where the Minister is pushing them out yet again. The change affects over 200,000 children in New Zealand. And many families will have taken legal advice on the basis of anticipating these changes as to what it will mean to them. And then on top of that, many of them will have taken financial advice, Mr Chair.
Dr David Clark, part of what you're talking about is in part 2 when we've already...
Sorry, this is part 3, Mr Chair.
I know.
Just expressly part 3 that I'm talking about.
Well, part of what you've been saying has been in part 2, so can you be specific in part 3 and draw my
Mr Chair, part 3 of the bill is about Minister's SOP 413. I'm debating Minister's SOP 413. Thank you, Mr Chair. I should have perhaps been more explicit in that regard. You're quite right. So the Minister's SOP introduces these delays that will see 210,000 children affected, and many families will have taken both legal advice and then subsequently financial advice because their personal circumstances will have changed as a result of the proposed changes to be implemented. And now the Minister, announcing a few days before Christmas, has told them they must again seek advice because the changes will not take place now, they will take place later. And this affects not only the obvious 210,000 children in the kinds of ways that one might expect in terms of primary care arrangement, who owes what to whom and so on, but also in ways that members of the public may not be aware unless they're facing the circumstance themselves, in terms of whether they are responsible for payments for teenagers attending educational institutions. That has changed from one minute to the next with this announcement from Mr Macleay. It is not only embarrassing for the government that it's passed this legislation and is now rapidly backing out of it because it can't implement it, but it is also horrific for these families who are often in straitened circumstances, dealing with difficult relationships, to discover that they now have to rearrange their affairs, take further financial advice, which often in many cases they will barely be able to afford, perhaps additional legal advice, in order to rearrange their affairs once again for a delay. And this Minister must take responsibility for this embarrassing back down by the government, this embarrassing change. Of course it was doing it because it was wanting to avoid another Nova Pay style debacle. This government has spent $50 million, let's not forget, on international consultants in trying to get the system right to cope with this change, Mr Chair. We've been told in Select Committee that $50 million have been spent already on consultants, international consultants, who have come back with the decision that, in principle, the system needs to be upgraded. In principle, we knew that 5 years ago, but in principle, the system needs to be upgraded so that changes can be made that will affect this kind of legislation, which is before the House right now and contained in SOP 413. This is a very germane point, Mr Chair, because without a system that can cope with these changes, we will see more parliamentary time wasted, we will see more embarrassing backdowns by the Minister of Revenue if the system is not up to scratch. The Prime Minister promised 2 years ago that he would, well, he didn't promise, he used some clever words, but he said that the system, let me quote him so I don't quote him out of context. 2 years ago, on Valentine's Day, the Prime Minister said tax policy was being held back because the computer systems, quote, can't actually support radical changes from government, end quote. He also said, quote, you don't want to be in a position where Parliament is held hostage to a lack of technology. Those are the Prime Minister's words, Mr Goldsmith. Those are the Prime Minister's words. And we should be outraged. It is a voice of thunder because we should be outraged. The Prime Minister said 2 years ago that this situation here should not occur. And I am interested to know what the Prime Minister is doing to hold his minister to account for this kind of embarrassing backdown in the House that costs millions of dollars of taxpayer money to correct as we end up debating the issues again, that costs many more millions of dollars, I don't doubt, in expenses for those who take financial advice around the country, the inconvenience of having to change financial arrangements, the personal time that is wasted and the misery that is created by chopping and changing, trying to create a fairer system. Well, it isn't fair if it messes ordinary New Zealanders about. And it goes explicitly against what the Prime Minister said. The Prime Minister has thrown $50 million at the problem, but we've only got to the point where we have an in-principle agreement that there's a problem and that more business cases will be developed. Well, more business cases and more business cases. We can imagine tens more millions being spent telling us that more than in principle, in actuality, we need to change the system. Well, it's blatantly obvious to ordinary New Zealanders, it's blatantly obvious to us on this side of the House that the system needs upgrading. We want the IRD to get on with it. They need clear direction from their Minister, clear support, but clearly they're not getting it because the Minister was not listening to the IRD when it raised this issue with the Minister to the incoming Minister 5 years ago when National came into government. This is a government that clearly is not prioritising these issues, is clearly not prioritising creating a fairer tax system for New Zealanders, and so we have this kind of child support issue, which I want to speak a little bit more about the detail of, Mr. Chair. What do we see in Schedule 1, Clause 1, referred to in SOP 413, Mr. Chair?
Dr. David Clark.
And covered in Part 3 of this bill, is a change in the dates. And effectively, all of the way through, we see the date pushed out by 1 year. Consistently, throughout. We have this document, which I'll hold up for the benefit of those at home. This is the Minister's SOP. I've highlighted where it says Child Support Act 1991, and there are dates, pages and pages of dates where we have postponement. We have the government postponing changes which affect over 210,000 New Zealand children. I am looking forward to the Minister taking a call to explain this embarrassing background, to explain to ordinary New Zealanders why they should have to rearrange their financial affairs once again, where their most intimate and difficult arrangements have been settled and made in the interests of their children, why they should have to revisit them because of his government's inaction on a system they were told 5 years ago desperately needed changing. This Minister is relatively new to these responsibilities. I will give him that, but I won't give him too much slack because he was the chair of FEC before that. He knows where these bills come from, he knows their history, he's taken over, and he is also a Minister of the Crown and has the responsibility for sorting this out. And the Prime Minister has made a promise 2 years ago that it would be sorted out, and it has not been. This promise that the Prime Minister made needs to be honoured in the interests of creating a fair tax system that can implement the kind of changes and give New Zealanders security in their future planning for their support payments for their children, for their personal arrangements for their children, and for the futures that those children represent in theory and in practice. These are the children that will hopefully go on into the workforce and be earning a better future for New Zealand when those of us sitting in this House are in our dotage. We depend upon these children and they deserve the kind of certainty that this government ought to be able to deliver. The first system that sits in the IRD, the legacy system, was built in 1992, as we know. It's not new to the Minister. It can't be new to the Minister. He's heard these things in Select Committee. He knows that the system we're operating on was designed 10 years before Facebook. It was designed before Google. For goodness sake, hardly anybody uses computer software that's that old. This must be a priority, and we must get beyond a simple in-principle agreement. We must get beyond spending tens of millions of dollars to point out the blatantly obvious. We must get to a point where this is fixed so New Zealanders can have a tax system that's fair and equitable, where we can make other changes that will be in the interests of growing the economy. Pro-growth tax reform is desperately needed. But in the Prime Minister's words, you don't want to be in a position where Parliament is held hostage to a lack of technology. We must move on. We're not the only country, they're not the only Western country with a tax system. It's not rocket science. It can't be rocket science. This Minister needs to step up to the plate, explain the embarrassing back down by the government, apologise to those New Zealand families who have been affected, make an apology on behalf of the government and lay out a credible plan for fixing this tax system so that we all can have the surety that those things that ordinary Western democracies take for granted, like education systems, health systems, roads and so on, will be funded into the future because we have a tax system that can actually collect the tax that is due and a tax system that can implement change that is in the interest of New Zealanders. So I'm looking forward to what the Minister has to say. I'm looking forward to his apology for this embarrassing background, but more than that, I'm looking forward to the Minister outlining a credible plan that details when we can expect the new system to be in place that can cope with changes, that can cope with a capital gains tax that would mean pro-growth tax reform for New Zealand, that can cope with changes to the child support system in a timely manner as and when they're needed, and that can cope with creating a better New Zealand that we on this side of the House want to see, a New Zealand that is signified in fairness and opportunity for all citizens.
Members, we come to the vote on Part 3. First, we have the Minister's amendments as set out on SOP number 413. The question is that the Minister's amendments be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that Part 3 is amended stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. We move to the schedules. The question is that Schedule 1 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Is this a point of order?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I thought we were at the time of commencement.
No, we're on the schedules.
Sorry, yes, I didn't.
No, you can't. No, the schedule's included in the part. We're just voting on the schedules.
Mr. Chair, my apologies.
The question is that Schedule 2 stand. The question is that Schedule 2 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. We now move to the clauses. And the question is that clauses 1 and 2 stand part. Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am first to express my disappointment that the Minister did not rise to apologise